Before we delve into the theological focus on walking in faith, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the book of Joshua. So we've talked about, just in reading that first 18 verses of Joshua 1, we've talked about the fact that Joshua is coming on the heels of what great leader? Moses. Moses, the one who stood up to the Pharaoh and cried out, "Let my people go." Moses, the one who walked through the wilderness, the one who stood by the Red Sea, who planted his staff in the sea, and God did what? Parted the waters. Moses, the one that heard their grumbling, that received the manna that came daily. Moses, the one that organized the community. Moses, the one that did not fail. And God starts Joshua 1 by saying, Moses is dead. Your life as it was before is not where you stand today. There has been a marked change, a transition. Raise your hand if at some point in your life you have had a transition that deep. A moment where you went from one place to the next. Where you needed God to show up that next morning and be with you then as God was with you before. And you needed the word of God to reassure you, just as I was with Moses, just as I was in the past, I am right now. If there's any one thing that has grabbed my heart as I've prepared to preach for this morning, it is literally the way that faith is executed in the present. I knew that, but do we really know that? When we grieve something that happened in the past, when we've experienced some kind of trauma that's forever marked us, when we stood on a mountaintop and experienced God in a way that we never had, and we stand here today and we walk by faith in the present. And God is faithful to be there. God is faithful to be there. The book of Joshua was written in the time, in the life of the community of Israel, in which they were literally forming their identity. And the identity of the Hebrews, of the Israelite community, was formed by the book of the law, the Jewish law that Jesus taught about and said that he came to fulfill. The life of the community was structured by this law, and that is why you find in this Joshua 1 the instruction, be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Don't turn to it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Raise your hand if you can keep every letter of the law. Right. Enter Jesus. Enter Jesus. And so while we are in Joshua, I don't ever want us to forget who we are as we read the book of Joshua. Enter Jesus, who fulfills the law. God, who says, first I gave you instruction to teach you what is right and wrong, and now I give you, in addition to my living word, in addition to my presence, I give you Jesus. The relationship that leads you from the present to the very next step, lest we forget who we are. How to walk by faith. How not to just believe intellectually, but how to apply our belief and the strength that we know lies in God. You would not be here this morning if you did not believe on some level that walking by faith changes the way you walk, right? But the real question is how, God? How do I take what I believe? How do I take what I believe of you? How do I apply that in such a way that I can live differently? That I can risk more freely when you call me to take the next step? That I can trust more deeply even after I have been hurt? And perhaps most important, how do I live into my faith such that I can move from where I am to where you're calling me to go? The longer we come out of COVID, the more that I believe we end up being stuck. We're just kind of stuck where we are. God, how do I walk in faith? How do I move from this place to the next season? Moses is dead. You're calling Joshua. 40 years we've wandered. And I just want to take the next step. Joshua is the story of a long-awaited promise that is finally realized. A nation after 40 years, not a nation state, not a political entity, but a community of people who literally have lived in the desert for 40 years are finally ready to walk into what arguably was there all along. How long has God been waiting for you to step into the next thing God has? How long have you been a limitation on where God wants you to go next? The powerful part about the way that Joshua is written, and I don't want us to lose sight of it, is that God is very clear. God is giving the blessing. God is giving the land. God is the one that has it queued up before us, and the invitation that we have is to follow God in strength and in courage, and to not be discouraged as we journey. To me, there's so much about that that is applicable to my own life. So many ways in which I know I become my worst enemy in moments. Ways in which I see what faith lived out can be, but I'm too afraid to take the next step. And God seems to say, Jen, Moses is dead. I am with you now. Let's walk forward in the faith that I have. The other thing that I never really paid attention to, the fact it's pretty obvious, but when we look at the community of the Israelites, they have been in the wilderness for 40 years. Do you think they had a military structure? No. Do you think that they had organization or the kind of strategy that one would need to literally push in to a walled city and take it? No. All of the ways that you and I in our lives say, God, I can't take that next step yet because it's not the right time. I don't have the troops in order. I don't have what I need. I'm too afraid of this, or I need to wait until I get that, or this season is not the season for. God says, I am giving you this next step. But you must be strong and courageous to walk into it. So the first thing I want us to pay attention to is that God is working in the present, not just the past. I believe that God has been present across the span of history. God existed before anything existed. God was before the Spirit hovered over the dark waters and brought forth life. God has known you before you were formed in your mother's womb. God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God has been present for generations and generations. But right now, in this moment, faith is a walking in the present, because the future belongs to God and the past is what brought us to where we are. So where are we in our lives right now? How do we walk in faith? How do we overcome fear? How do we face big obstacles and keep going? How do we trust God? I like this one, in a way that is smart, right? For all of us who like to say, I'm not going to think, I'm not going to plan, I'm not going to do it, I'm just going to throw myself before God. No. How do we trust God in a way that is smart and self-disciplined enough that God is collaborating with us? How do we live in the present and not in the past? And what do we need to do in order to move with the witness of God? The second thing I want us to consider in the book of Joshua is that God is very, very clear that God is present in all circumstances. In the darkest night of your soul, when you don't have the words to articulate the churn in your head, in the places where you are sure that the past has determined the present and the future, in the moments when you feel alone, in the times when you cannot see, God is where? Where? Present. The power of a God in the present tense is that God is here right now. And the power of a God who is present in all circumstances is that there is nowhere that you and I can escape from God's presence. I was recently talking to someone who said to me, I am tired of going over the details of my past. I'm tired of rehearsing all of the things I could have done different, the decisions that marked this, the ways that I could have grown, the opportunities that God gave me. I feel like I've learned what I needed to learn, and somehow I just stayed stuck in the repass and the repass and the repass, and I have finally decided to live in the joy of today. Hallelujah. God says to Joshua, Moses is dead, but you, Joshua, are the one that I am calling now. If you turn back in your scriptures, Joshua 1, after God says again, Moses is dead, now you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised. Your territory will extend. No one will be able to stand against you. I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Who else said that? What did Jesus say to his disciples when they stood in fear of death, when they stood in fear of their own sin? God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. There is nowhere you can go from my presence. I didn't leave you in the past. I will not leave you today, and I will not leave you in the future. And so we serve a God of the present who leads us forward, and yet we have this extraordinary promise of a God who has confirmed God's faithfulness over time. It's one of the most beautiful things of being able to talk to people who are older. I remember the blessing it was to talk to my grandparents. It was particularly my paternal grandfather who would articulate all of the not so smart stuff that he did. And the way in which God just kept seeking him. And then he would get teary-eyed to say, and this is where I am now. We serve a God of the present who was with us in the past, who will never leave us nor forsake us now, a God who always has plans for us, hope for us, and a future for us, even when Moses is dead and we don't want to be the Joshua that's called to make the next step. How many times in your own journey has God laid before you the possibility to walk in faith and you've just said, I really don't want to move from where I'm at? I may not exactly understand where you're leading, God, but I'm too scared to move here, and the obstacles before me are too big. Joshua literally was with a ragtag group of Israelites who had no military structure. The leader who had led them in the wilderness was dead. God was speaking to him, and if you heard the people say, okay, Joshua, we'll follow you, if God's with you like God was with Moses. Have you ever felt like somebody said, I trust you, but? Okay. Joshua stood in the moment where he probably just wanted to stand still. And yet in order to receive the promise that he was to receive and the people were to receive with him, he had to move. God is a God of the present. God is with us in all circumstances. And God allows us to rely on God's power to fulfill his command. Fear, the study we're using says, keeps us from obeying God. The promise of God's power gets us started and keeps us going. If you and I stand wherever we are in our lives now and say, God, I trust you. I know that you are able. I know that you have walked people out of circumstances that are more challenging than this. I know that you have walked with people through grief. I know that you have walked in the valley of the shadow of death. I know that you have faced formidable opponents. I know, God, that the impossible has been set before people, but you, God, have made it able. Because I believe that, even though I don't feel it, I'll take the next step. I believe in feelings. Ask anybody in my family. You want to talk about feelings? Come talk to me. You want to talk about the action plan? Go talk to my husband. Right? I believe in feelings. But when we allow our feelings of fear to determine what God is capable of doing, we forfeit the very promise God has laid beside us. We acknowledge I'm afraid, Lord. Like that scripture, I love it. I believe, Lord, help my unbelief. I'm walking, Lord, but forgive me when I take a step back. Right? Relying on God's power doesn't mean that you don't feel afraid. It doesn't mean that the obstacles are not formidable. It doesn't mean that you don't know how you're going to do it. Some of you are aware that I'm currently serving as the preschool director in the church lead, and people are saying to me, how are you doing? I don't know. But I know that God is with us. And I know it's one step at a time. I know it's one step at a time. So I trust God in the present. I believe that God will never leave me nor forsake me. And I rely on God's power to fulfill God's commands even when I'm afraid. And I want us to go back to the book of Joshua. How many times does God say to Joshua, not only be strong and courageous, in verse 6, because I will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Sometimes we forget about the fact that the lives we are living belong to more than just us. I am convinced that every human being here present has somebody praying, interceding for you in a way that you don't even know. And that person may have interceded for you years ago. You may be the fulfillment of a promise made to somebody you never met. You may be what your ancestors were promised by God. You may never see the face of the one who intercedes. I had a friend who grew up as a Christian in India, which was not easy. And I don't know why this came to mind now, but she always talked about every time she walked out of the house, old, grown, her grandmother would mark her with the sign of the cross. Of course, when you're 20, that's just annoying, right? All the time, this blessing. Sometimes our lives don't just belong to us. They belong to those who are interceding and praying for us. And not only our families, but they belong to the bigger purpose that God is accomplishing. Entering the promised land wasn't just about Joshua recognizing what God was calling him to. Entering the promised land was about a bigger picture that God was unfolding. Be strong and courageous because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. The fourth thing I want us to pay attention to is that this is a faith that is forged in movement. Oftentimes when we get afraid, we have one of two responses. We either run, well, actually maybe three. Run, hide, or try to fix it. Raise your hand if you're a runner. Things get rough and you run. Go ahead, raise your hand. Okay, somebody in the tech booth, right there. Thank you. Only the person in the tech booth. All right, things get hard and you hide. Raise your hand if you're a hider. Come on, you only got one more option. Raise your hand if when things get hard, you just dig in and try to fix it in your own strength. Raise your hand, right? And yet, God is calling Joshua to do none of those things. God is not saying, run away, it's too hard. God is not saying, stay in the wilderness another 40 years. God is not saying, do it in your own strength. God is saying, walk with me. Walk with me. I want us to look at Joshua 1, verses 2 to 3. 3, actually. God is saying, you're going to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them. I also want you to think about these crossing of boundaries, right? The transition from Moses to Joshua, the crossing of the boundary into this land. In verse 3, God says, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. I want us to think about that. God can't give you a new place to set your foot if you don't take a step. God can't meet us if we aren't willing to move from where we are. As part of the study, there is this poem that I actually heard earlier in my life, but I had forgotten, by Patrick Overton, and it says, it's more like a saying, when you walk to the edge of all the light you have, when you're at the very end, and you take that step into the darkness of the unknown, you must believe that one of two things will happen. As you step out into the darkness, either there will be something solid for you to stand on. I will be with you each step you take, God says. Something solid to stand on, or if there can't be, you have to trust that God will teach you how to fly. As you get to the edge of the limits of what you can see, believe, the strength that you have, we take a step forward, trusting that God will meet every step we take, or that if there is not ground under our feet, that God will teach us to fly, or that the angels will come and hold us up. But walking by faith requires the trust. I believe that we as a community, not just Epworth, but in general, we're a little bit shell-shocked from COVID. We're a little bit afraid to move. We're a little bit afraid to take another step. The very trust that we had in the functioning of the world as it was has been rocked. Relationships have been damaged. Patterns have been changed. Even the way in which we experience God is different. But God is the same, calling us in this present moment to acknowledge Moses and walk with Joshua, to believe that God really has never left us nor forsaken us, to believe that the story's not done yet, the blessing that you are to be, the work that you are to do is not completed, and the promise made to ancestors and those you have never met is yet to be fulfilled. And so we are called to get ready. Joshua gave the people 3 days. Get ready. We're about to cross the Jordan. And God says, every step you take, I will meet it. Every step you take, I will meet it. We're no longer naive enough to believe that the future will be simple or easy or what we imagine. But we know that right now, as we walk by faith, God is with us. And so in closing, I want you to consider the things that you are afraid of, the rough places that feel like they might define you from here forward, the grief you hold for what was and is not currently. And I invite you to consider that God's invitation to us, as God gives the next step, is to be what? What are we called to be? Strong and courageous, and to not be discouraged. Be strong. Be courageous. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God goes with you.